He rode in expecting nothing, just empty land and a stranger's name on a deed. What Jesse Barrett found instead was a cedar cabin stocked for a winter he hadn't planned, shelves lined with supplies someone had counted carefully, and a stack of journals written in a hand he had never seen before. His grandfather's hand. A man who had watched him from ridgelines and schoolyards and county fairs for 14 years, without ever once saying his name aloud. Jesse was 18, orphaned, and had spent his whole life being carefully, kindly, unnecessary. No land, no roots, no one who needed him to stay. He had followed the season so long, he had forgotten there was another way to live. But now he is standing in a dead man's cabin, reading his own childhood in someone else's handwriting. And somewhere between the maintenance logs and the planting calendars and the short, honest entries that tracked him across a decade, Jesse begins to understand what was actually left to him. Not the 60 acres, not the stove or the cistern or the 30 years of soil notes. Something harder to deed and harder to lose. And when a land speculator comes riding up to take it all away, Jesse Barrett will discover something his grandfather never quite managed. That the strongest thing a man can build isn't a cabin or a hay patch or a legal defense. It's the people willing to stand behind him when it counts. The journal falls open to the last entry, and Jesse Barrett reads his own name in a stranger's handwriting. Jesse turned 8 today. Saw him from the ridge above the schoolyard in Billings. He laughed when the teacher dropped her chalk. Good lungs. Good laugh. His mother's laugh. He is standing in a cedar cabin he has never entered before today, on land he did not know existed until 3 weeks ago, reading the private thoughts of a man who never once introduced himself. Outside, the October wind pushes through the pines with a sound like breathing. The single window faces east, toward a ridge so clean and steep it looks drawn by hand. Jesse reads the entry again. Then he sets the journal on the table, very carefully, the way you set down something you are afraid to break, and looks around at everything the old man left behind. 6 weeks earlier, Jesse Barrett owned 4 things: a horse named Copperhead, a saddle with a cracked fender, a wool bedroll, and a habit of waking before dawn out of old instinct. He was 18 years old and had been a cowhand for 3 years, working whatever ranch would take him through the season. He did not consider this a tragedy. He considered it a Tuesday. He was mucking a stall at the Halverson spread outside Miles City when old Pete Halverson leaned on the fence post and watched him work. "You ever think about what you want, boy?" Jesse kept his eyes on the shovel. "Want doesn't buy hay." Pete was quiet a moment. "No," he said, "but it does tell you where to point yourself." Jesse said nothing. He had never had a reason to point himself anywhere in particular. A man with no land, no family, and no forwarding address just follows the season. The grass is always somewhere. The work is always somewhere. You go where you are needed, and you leave when the need is finished. He did not yet understand that there was a difference between following the season and building a life. The letter arrived at the Halverson Ranch on a Wednesday morning in late August, carried by a circuit rider who seemed mildly offended to have been entrusted with something so thin and unremarkable. Jesse was splitting wood behind the barn when Pete's wife, Doris, came out holding it between 2 fingers, like it might be damp. "It's addressed to you," she said, with the tone of someone announcing a minor inconvenience. Jesse set down the axe. The envelope was cream-colored, stiff, and bore the return address of a law office in Helena. His full name was written on the front in careful block letters: Jesse Allen Barrett. Nobody called him that. Hardly anyone knew that was his name. He opened it standing in the yard. The letter was from an attorney named Harlan Voss, who identified himself as the executor of the estate of one Ambrose Roy Barrett, deceased, of Pine Ridge, Montana Territory. Ambrose Barrett had passed on the 14th of August. He had left no wife, no surviving children, and only one named beneficiary in his will. Jesse read the name on the page and stood very still. He had never met his grandfather. He knew almost nothing about him. His mother, Margaret Barrett, had died of fever when Jesse was 4, and the relatives who took him in afterward, distant cousins on his father's side in Billings, had mentioned Ambrose exactly once, in the context of explaining why no help had come from that direction. That old man lives alone in the mountains and doesn't associate. Jesse had filed this information away as a child files away information about weather. Noted, not dwelled upon. His father, James Barrett, had died in a mining accident when Jesse was 2. Jesse had no memory of him at all, only a photograph someone had pressed into his hand at age 12. A young man squinting into the sun with Jesse's own jaw and Jesse's own uncomfortable expression, as though both of them had been asked to stand still for longer than felt natural. Jesse had grown up in the Billings household of his cousin Arthur Finch, who was 20 years older than him, and fundamentally kind but fundamentally occupied. Arthur ran a dry goods business. He had a wife and 3 children of his own. Jesse was an extra body in a house that had already been counted and measured, and everyone involved knew it and nobody said so. And that was fine. Jesse did not resent Arthur. He simply understood, very early, that the household was not his home, and that he would need to build something eventually, when he figured out what building looked like. At 15, he had left to work cattle and had not returned. Arthur sent a letter every few months. Jesse sent one back, brief and factual, reporting his location and his health. This was the entirety of their relationship, and both of them seemed comfortable with its dimensions. Now, standing in the Halverson yard with a letter from a dead stranger's lawyer, Jesse felt something he could not immediately name. It was not grief. He had no grief available for a man he didn't know. It was not excitement exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when a door you didn't know was there swings open in front of you, and you can't yet see what's on the other side. He went back inside and read the letter 3 more times. The parcel was 60 acres in the upper foothills north of Pine Ridge, deeded to Jesse Allen Barrett outright, free of any lien or encumbrance. There was a structure on the property. Attorney Voss advised Jesse to present himself in Helena at his earliest convenience to execute the necessary paperwork. Jesse showed the letter to Pete Halverson that evening. Pete read it twice, handed it back, and said, "Well, well," Jesse agreed. "You going?" "I don't know what I'd do with 60 acres. Pete considered this. "You'd have 60 acres, he said, as though this answered everything, which, Jesse thought later, it probably did. He gave Pete 2 weeks' notice and finished the work he had started. He was methodical about this. He had always been methodical. On the ranch, methodical was the same thing as trustworthy, and trustworthy was the only currency Jesse had ever been able to save reliably. He rode to Helena on a cool September morning, presented himself to Harlan Voss's office on the 2nd floor of a brick building on Last Chance Gulch, and signed his name to a document thicker than any book he had read. Voss was a compact, efficient man with round spectacles and the personality of a well-organized drawer. "Your grandfather was specific," Voss said, not looking up from the paperwork. "He wanted no delay and no conditions. The land is yours as of today. Did he say why he left it to me?" Voss looked up. He studied Jesse for a moment in a way that felt slightly longer than professional. He said in the codicil that he hoped it would be useful. Jesse waited, but nothing followed. He rode out of Helena on a Thursday with directions to the parcel, a general description of the terrain, and the name of the nearest town. He rode for 2 days, camping in the open the way he always did, cooking over a small fire, talking to Copperhead when the silence got heavy. On the 3rd morning he found the boundary marker, and then, pushing through a screen of spruce and around the base of a granite outcrop, he found the cabin. He dismounted. He stood in front of it for a long moment. It was cedar, chinked well, with a solid door and a good roof and a window box someone had built with real care. It looked like a place where someone had lived with intention. He had not expected anything. He had told himself, the entire ride out, to expect nothing. Empty land was still land. An orphaned cowhand with a wool bedroll did not get to expect cabins. He opened the door and went inside. The inside of the cabin was one large room, clean and ordered in a way that spoke of long habit. A cast-iron stove occupied the northwest corner. A wooden table sat beneath the east window, flanked by 2 chairs. A bunk built into the south wall was made up with a wool blanket, gray with a red stripe at the hem. Shelves lined the wall above the bunk, holding a row of supplies: flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, a tin of hard candy, arranged with the kind of precision that suggested the person who placed them there had thought about who would open them next. On the table was a small stack of oilskin-wrapped packages tied with twine, each one labeled in block print. The largest was labeled simply, "Read First." Jesse sat down in the chair that faced the door. The chair, he realized, from which the window behind him framed the eastern ridge, and untied the oilskin. Inside was a journal, black cover, cloth binding, worn at the corners. He opened it. If you're reading this, you found the place. That's good. The directions weren't easy, and I didn't make them easy on purpose. A man who can't find his own land doesn't deserve to keep it. My name is Ambrose Barrett. I am your grandfather on your father's side. I know you don't know me. That is my fault entirely, and I won't spend any time explaining it because explanations don't build anything. I have watched you from a distance for most of your life. I know that sounds peculiar. I expect it is peculiar, but I want you to understand that I knew what I was doing when I left you this land, and I want you to know why. Start with the journal on the top shelf, third from the left. That one starts at the beginning. Jesse sat without moving for a full minute. Then he stood up and found the journal. The journal on the third shelf was older. Its cover faded to the color of a winter sky, the pages thickened by years of humidity and handling. Ambrose Barrett's handwriting inside was the same careful block print, but slightly larger, earlier, Jesse guessed, less compressed. The first entry was dated June 1866. I rode north today out of Helena and did not look back. I am done with the family business in the way a man is done with something when continuing it would cost him his soul. Howard can have the whole enterprise. I leave it to him gladly. Jesse didn't know who Howard was. He read on. The journals. There were, he discovered, 9 of them in total, spanning from 1866 to the summer before Ambrose's death, were not addressed to anyone. They were not confessional or sentimental in the conventional sense. They were the record of a man building something, in the same way a foreman keeps a record of construction. Materials ordered, work completed, problems encountered, solutions applied. Ambrose had built the cabin himself, cleared 2 acres of the lower meadow, put in a kitchen garden, dug a well, established a small woodlot on a managed rotation. He wrote about these things with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone for whom work was its own justification. But threaded through the construction logs and planting notes and weather observations were other entries, shorter ones. These were the ones that stopped Jesse's hand on the page. August, 1874. Heard from a circuit preacher that Margaret's boy is living with the Finch family in Billings. Arthur Finch is a decent man. I know his father. The boy will be all right. I told myself I wouldn't go to Billings. I went to Billings. I rode past the house on Coulson Street twice and went home. Jesse was 4 years old in August of 1874. He stood up from the table and walked to the door and opened it and looked out at the yard for a while. Copperhead was grazing along the tree line, entirely uninterested in Jesse's internal state. The October light was thin and gold and slanted through the spruce at an angle that made everything look painted. He went back inside and kept reading. The short entries continued through the years with a consistency that was, Jesse thought, either touching or troubling, and he was not yet sure which. Ambrose had seen him at the county fair in Billings in 1875. He had been present, at an unspecified distance, at Jesse's mother's grave on the 5th anniversary of her death in 1879. He had watched Jesse leave the Finch household in 1885 and followed his employment at various ranches through a network of correspondence with people Jesse had never known were reporting back. He's good with horses, one entry read. Halverson says he's the most reliable hand he's had in a decade. Not surprised. His father was like that. Reliable right down to the bone. Jesse stopped at that sentence for a long time. He did not know how he felt about any of this. He tried to examine the feeling the way you'd examine a piece of equipment for damage, methodically, without panic. Here were the options, as he understood them. Option 1. His grandfather had been a man of deep but paralyzed affection, unable to close the distance he himself had created, watching from a distance because coming closer required an explanation he could not give. The cabin was his apology. The journals were his attempt at an introduction. Option 2. Ambrose Barrett had been a peculiar, solitary person who had organized his peculiarity into a system, and Jesse was the beneficiary of that system without it meaning anything tender at all. Option 3, and this was the one Jesse kept circling back to, the one that made the warm feeling in his chest compete with something that felt like old grief. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the truth of one did not cancel the truth of the other. He ate supper that evening using the cabin's supplies: beans from the shelf, coffee from the blue tin, a pan of cornbread made in the cast-iron skillet that hung on the wall beside the stove. The kitchen was stocked like someone had planned for a winter. There was more food than Jesse would eat in 3 months alone. After supper, he went through the other oilskin packages on the table. One contained the deed to the parcel, a survey map, and a letter from Voss confirming the legal transfer. One contained $23 in paper money with a note that said simply, "Spring supplies. Don't spend it on anything except what the land needs." One contained a folded paper with a list of names and locations, neighbors, the nearest town, a man named Gil Foss, who Ambrose described as reliable, honest, occasionally irritating, which I respect. The last package contained a photograph. Jesse unfolded the paper around it and held it near the lamp. It was a man in his 50s, standing in front of the cabin door. He was lean, weathered, with a full beard going to gray and eyes that looked at the camera the way Jesse's own looked at things, not unfriendly, but careful, measuring. He was not smiling, but his posture had something easy in it, something at home. On the back, Ambrose Roy Barrett, 1880. The cabin took 3 years to build right. Worth it. Jesse set the photograph on the table beside the open journal and looked at them for a long time. He did not know if he wanted to stay. He did not know if he was capable of staying, of being one man in one place with one piece of land that belonged to him and no seasonal movement to fall back on. He had never done that. He did not know how, but he looked at the photograph and he looked at the journals and he thought, this man found a way to be useful to someone he never spoke to. Maybe that was worth something. Maybe that was a starting point. In the morning, Jesse saddled Copperhead and rode the boundary of the parcel. It took most of the day. The 60 acres ran from a creek at the lower meadow up through a band of mixed spruce and pine to a rocky ridge on the north side that looked out over a valley wide enough to make you feel appropriately small. The survey map in Ambrose's oilskin matched the land precisely. Corners marked with cairns the old man had built himself, each one a little different, like he'd been practicing. The land was not spectacular. It was not fertile bottom ground or prime grazing range. It was mountain foothills, which meant it was beautiful and demanding in roughly equal measure, and everything it gave you it made you earn. The creek was clean and cold and ran year-round, according to the notes in the journal. The meadow was enough for a kitchen garden and a modest hay patch if you cleared the east end. The timber was healthy. It was enough. That was what Jesse kept coming back to as he rode the boundary and came back around to the cabin at dusk. It was enough, not easy. Not a gift in the sense of something handed over with no work attached. It was a gift in the other sense, the harder sense, of someone seeing what you needed and providing the conditions for you to build it yourself. He unsaddled Copperhead, fed him, and stood in the yard watching the last light go off the ridge. "All right," he said, to no one in particular, to the ridge, to the cabin, to the photograph on the table inside. He would stay. He would learn how. 4 days after Jesse's decision to stay, he rode into Pine Ridge for the first time. Pine Ridge was not large. It had a general store, a post office, a smithy, a church of debated denomination, and a saloon that served coffee in the mornings without apparent shame. The street was unpaved and the boardwalk was uneven, and it had the satisfied, compressed look of a town that had decided exactly what it was and saw no reason to renegotiate. Jesse stopped at the general store for nails and a new axe handle. The man behind the counter was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with the expression of someone who had been asked to carry a great deal of weight over a long period and had decided to find this amusing rather than tiring. "You're the Barrett boy," the man said before Jesse had introduced himself. "The one that got Ambrose's place." "Jesse Barrett," Jesse said. "Gil Foss," the man said, extending a hand. "Your grandfather wrote me a letter about you about 6 months before he died. Told me to watch for you." Jesse shook the hand. "What did the letter say?" Gil Foss considered this with the air of someone deciding how much to give away at once. "Said you were capable," he said. "Said you'd need the winter to figure that out for yourself." He set the axe handle on the counter. "Said to be patient with you. Jesse spent the first 2 weeks learning the cabin the way you learn a new horse, carefully, attending to its moods, not assuming you know what you're doing yet. The roof had one weak spot over the northwest corner. He found it on the first rainy night when a small, persistent drip began above the stove, sending a thin stream of water precisely into the coffee tin, with the dedication of something that had been waiting for rain. He patched it with cedar shingles. He split himself from a standing deadfall near the timberline. The job took a full day, and he redid the final section twice before it satisfied him. The stove required reseating. One of its legs had settled into the floorboards over years of heat cycling, listing the whole unit 2 degrees to the west, which was enough to make the coffee pot slide if you weren't watching it. Jesse leveled the floor section, cut a new support piece, and reset the leg. When he first saw this problem, he'd checked Ambrose's maintenance journal and found an entry from 1882. "The stove has started to lean. I'll see to it in spring." Apparently, spring had never arrived for that particular task. Jesse noted in the margin of the journal, in his own more utilitarian hand, "Reset the leg. October, 1888. He felt slightly self-conscious doing this, then decided it was the most natural thing in the world. He split wood every afternoon until he had a cord and a half stacked against the north wall of the cabin, covered with canvas. The work was straightforward and satisfying in the way that purely physical tasks are satisfying. The problem is visible, the solution is visible, the result is visible and stackable. In the evenings, he read. He worked through the journals in order, not rushing them, taking his time with the entries, the way you take your time with a meal that has been prepared with care. Ambrose's voice on the page was dry and precise and occasionally, without any apparent awareness, funny. An 1877 entry described a failed attempt to establish a beehive. "The bees had views about this that differed from mine. They won." Jesse found himself reading certain passages aloud to Copperhead, which, he acknowledged, was a sign he needed human company sooner rather than later. The human company arrived, as advertised, in the form of Gil Foss. He appeared at the cabin on a Saturday morning in late October, riding a stout gray horse and carrying draped across his saddle a smoked ham that he presented with the unself-conscious practicality of a man who believed a gift should be edible. He accepted coffee, sat in the chair that faced away from the door, leaving Jesse the seat Ambrose had always used, and looked around the cabin with the unhurried attention of a man cataloging. "You've been busy," Gil said. "It needed work." Ambrose kept up with most of it. Toward the end, he slowed down some. Gil wrapped both hands around his tin cup. He knew that. Drove him half mad, knowing things needed doing and not having the body for it anymore. Jesse looked up from his own cup. "How long did you know him?" 20 years, near enough. He came to Pine Ridge in '68 and never left." Gil paused. "He was a private man. I don't mean unfriendly. I mean that he'd thought carefully about what he would share with the world and what he'd keep, and he wasn't interested in revisiting that arrangement." Another pause. "He asked about you every time I rode up here. Every single time." Jesse didn't answer that directly. He asked, instead, about the land, what Gil knew of it, what its limitations were, what the winters were like at this elevation. This was not deflection exactly. It was that he needed to know, and he was more comfortable asking questions about things he could act on. Gil talked about the land with the authority of a man who had worked his own parcel for 2 decades. The winters were long, and the elevation made them colder than the valley floor by a reliable 8 degrees. The creek froze in January, but there was spring runoff that more than compensated. Ambrose had dug a cistern 20 years back and lined it with stone, and it held water through August most years if you managed it carefully. The meadow soil was decent but thin over shale on the north end. The south end, near the creek bank, was darker and deeper, and had grown Ambrose's kitchen garden for 20 years without complaint. "He ever try grazing?" Jesse asked. 6 or 8 cattle, most years, not more. The meadow won't support more without taking from your garden hay. Gil looked at him. "You thinking of something larger?" "I'm thinking about what's possible." "That," Gil said, "is exactly what your grandfather said to me the first time I rode up here." He seemed to find this satisfying rather than strange. He set down his cup. "Come on. I'll walk the south meadow with you." They spent 2 hours in the field. Gil had the gift, rare in Jesse's experience, of explaining things once and then being quiet. He pointed out where the shale came close to the surface, where the soil deepened, where Ambrose had managed the drainage with a shallow ditch along the creek bank. Jesse walked the ground, crouched to pick up handfuls of soil, stood to read the lay of the land, the way he'd been reading horses since he was 12. Not looking for what you hoped to see, but for what was actually there. "There's room to expand the hay patch if I move the vegetable garden north," Jesse said almost to himself. "The north end's thinner," Gil reminded him. "Better soil amendments, if I build the compost right." Gil looked at him. "You know composting?" "I know the theory. I've seen it done. I'm willing to learn the rest." Jesse stood and looked back toward the cabin. "Ambrose's notes go into it some. He was working on improving the north end the last few years, from what I read." "He was," Gil said. "He said he was building the land up for whoever came next." He was quiet a moment. "I don't think he knew, for a long time, who that would be." The walk back to the cabin was companionable in a way Jesse was not used to. He did not often trust people quickly. He had grown up in a house where he was welcome but not necessary, and he had learned to be careful about the difference. But Gil Foss was neither warm in an excessive way nor cool in a guarded way. He was simply present, consistent, interested in the work. Jesse found this easy to be around. At the cabin, Gil mounted his horse and pulled on his gloves. "There's a community gathering in Pine Ridge on the first Saturday of November," he said, "at the church. Don't let the location put you off. It's mostly neighbors eating and talking about the winter. Your grandfather went every year until he couldn't ride anymore." He looked down at Jesse from the saddle. "Be good for people to know who you are." Jesse thought about the Billings household, the careful accounting of welcomes and limits that passed for family life. He thought about a decade of seasonal work, moving from ranch to ranch, belonging nowhere in particular. "I'll come," he said. Gil nodded, satisfied, and turned the gray horse toward the trail. Jesse watched him ride out until the spruce closed around him. Then he stood in the yard a moment longer, listening to the creek and the wind and the particular silence of a place where something has been cared for over a long time. He went back inside and picked up the next journal. The November gathering was held in the Pine Ridge Church on a day of hard blue sky and breath cloud cold. Jesse arrived with a jar of Ambrose's stored honey. He'd found 3 jars on the bottom shelf, labeled in that careful hand, and bringing one had felt right in a way he couldn't have explained precisely. He knew almost no one. He stood near the door at first in the way of a man who has spent years being new somewhere and has learned that doors are good options. Gil materialized beside him with the reliability of someone who had anticipated this exact behavior. He moved Jesse through the room with the practiced ease of a man who was liked broadly and widely and had opinions about useful introductions. Margaret Crane ran the general store's dry goods section while her husband ran the hardware side. She had a direct manner and a laugh that arrived unexpectedly. Walt Briggs ran cattle in the lower valley and had the handshake of a man who considered handshakes a form of testimony. Ruth Adler, who was 70-something and had been in Pine Ridge since before the church was built, took one look at Jesse and said, "You have Ambrose's eyes," and turned back to her conversation without ceremony. Jesse set the honey on the food table and found himself, without quite planning it, in the middle of 3 separate conversations. Walt Briggs asked about his cattle plans with a rancher's directness. Not nosiness exactly, but the professional interest of a man who understood that knowing your neighbor's operations was good land management. Jesse answered honestly. 6 head to start, maybe 8 if the meadow expanded as he planned. Walt nodded as if this was a reasonable answer and moved on to asking about his water situation, and they spent 20 minutes discussing the creek and the cistern and the spring runoff patterns at that elevation in a way that felt less like small talk and more like an exchange of useful information between people who would need each other through a Montana winter. Margaret Crane pressed a piece of dried apple cake on him with the air of someone who had taken a position on the matter and was not open to further debate. And they talked about the general store's dry goods and what Jesse might need before December. She knew, without being told, that he'd moved on to the Barrett place. Everyone knew, he was realizing. A new person in Pine Ridge was apparently a matter of community record. Your grandfather ordered his winter supplies the second week of October every year, Margaret said. Never varied. You're cutting it close. I'll be in Monday, Jesse said. She nodded, satisfied. Ruth Adler found him again near the stove later in the afternoon, apparently having decided that her initial assessment warranted a follow-up. She was small and sharp-eyed, and had the patient stillness of a person who has survived enough winters to be unimpressed by most emergencies. How are the journals? She asked. Jesse blinked. You knew about them? Ambrose read parts of them to me the last 2 winters. He had trouble with his eyes by then and liked someone to listen while he worked out loud which parts were worth keeping. She looked at him without particular softness, but also without any absence of warmth. It was the look of a person who had decided to be honest with you as a form of respect. He was proud of you. He didn't use that word, because he didn't consider he'd earned the right to use it. But I watched him, and that's what it was. Jesse held his coffee cup in both hands and said nothing for a moment. He could have written, he finally said, or come. Yes, Ruth said simply. He could have. She let that sit. People who've made large mistakes early in their lives sometimes spend the rest of those lives calculating whether they've earned the right to correct them. Sometimes they calculate too long. She reached over and patted his hand once, briskly. You're here now. The land is yours. Don't waste time being angry at a ghost. It was not the most sentimental advice Jesse had ever received. It was, he thought, possibly the most useful. He rode home that evening in the dark, the temperature dropping cleanly toward freezing, the stars overhead so thick and low that Copperhead's breath rose in plumes and caught the starlight. The trail back up to the parcel was one he was beginning to know. The left-hand rock at the first bend, the soft spot in the track where the spring runoff crossed, the smell of the spruce when you got within a quarter mile of the cabin. He had been to community events before, in every town adjacent to every ranch where he'd worked. He had always left them feeling mildly unmoved, present, pleasant, disconnected, as though the warmth in the room was something happening on the other side of a window. He had attributed this to his own temperament, to some fundamental quality of separateness that was simply part of who he was. He noticed, on the ride home, that he did not feel that way tonight. He felt, in the tentative and careful way of a man who does not trust new feelings prematurely, as though the room had contained people who would be his neighbors in the actual sense, not because they were obligated to be, because they had chosen to introduce themselves. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. November came in hard and stayed that way. The first snow arrived on the 5th and did not leave. Jesse welcomed this in the way he welcomed difficult but comprehensible problems. Cold was solvable. You burned wood, you kept the stock warm, you checked the cistern daily so it didn't freeze at the inlet. He had prepared well. His cord and a half was under canvas. His 6 cattle were in the small barn Ambrose had built north of the cabin, and his kitchen stores were full from the Monday trip to Crane's store, where Margaret had helped him build a supply list with the efficient thoroughness of someone who had been doing this for other people's first winters for 20 years. He began working through Ambrose's remaining oilskin packages in the evenings. He had been rationing them, he recognized, not wanting to reach the end. But the November dark came early and was complete, and the journals and packages were both practical and the best company available. The 4th package contained a hand-drawn map of the parcel with detailed notes on every section, soil depth, drainage behavior, prevailing wind, winter sun angles by month. It was an extraordinarily detailed document. Ambrose had been adding to it for 20 years, and the annotations were in different inks, different pressures, different handwritings that tracked the decades like rings in a tree. Some notations were simply updates. Creek Bank, South End, better than expected, 1879. Some were corrections. Initial drainage estimate wrong. Shale runs deeper than I thought, 1871. See revised sketch, page 2. Jesse spread this map on the table and studied it alongside the survey map from the attorney and the notes he'd been making in a new ledger he'd bought at Crane's store. He began building, in the evenings, a working picture of the parcel. What it was, what it could be, what order of operations would bring it from its current state to the state he was beginning to envision. It was not a grand vision. He was not a man given to grand visions. It was specific, a functional homestead that supported itself through a combination of cattle, kitchen garden, and timber management, with enough surplus to carry through a bad year. Modest, achievable. He had Ambrose's 20 years of notes to work from, which was an inheritance as real as the land itself. On the second Saturday of November, Gil Foss appeared again, this time with his wife, Harriet, who was taller than Gil, quieter than Gil, and possessed of a quality of observation that made Jesse feel he was being read accurately but without judgment. She brought bread she had baked that morning, still faintly warm in its cloth wrap. She walked the cabin with her eyes in the way of someone who had known it before, taking in the changes Jesse had made, her expression reflecting something he couldn't immediately interpret. "It looks cared for," she said, when she came back to the table. "It was already cared for," Jesse said. "Yes," she said, "and now it is again." She sat down and poured her own coffee with the ease of a person who had done exactly this in exactly this room many times before. "Ambrose used to have us for supper every few weeks. Harriet did most of the cooking," Gil said from his seat by the stove, "because your grandfather's cooking was an experience you survived rather than enjoyed." "That's not entirely fair," Harriet said. "The beans in 1879, Gil said, in the tone of a man citing legal precedent. Harriet did not directly dispute the beans in 1879. She began instead, with great composure, to teach Jesse how to use the cabin's Dutch oven. This was not planned. It arose naturally from a conversation about what Jesse had been cooking and what he hadn't tried. Harriet had opinions about the Dutch oven that were practical and specific, and she communicated them the way skilled people communicate what they know, without condescension, without excessive simplification, just the relevant information delivered at the right pace. Jesse learned to listen to instruction of this quality immediately. He had learned it on his first cattle drive at 15, when an experienced hand had shown him how to read a herd's mood. Good instruction was a form of respect. By the time they sat down to supper, a bean and salt pork pot that bore no resemblance to the 1879 incident, apparently, Jesse felt that the cabin was, for the first time, a place that had been visited rather than merely occupied. He said this at the table, imprecisely, and Gil nodded. "That's what a home is," Gil said. "A place people visit and then leave part of themselves in." Jesse looked around the cabin, the stove he had releveled, the shelves Ambrose had built, the map on the table, the photograph leaning against the lamp, the window that faced the eastern ridge. "He left this whole place for me," Jesse said. It came out more quietly than he intended. "Someone I never knew, who never said one word to me, left me a place where people come and eat and talk." Harriet looked at him with the same accurate, unjudging attention she had given the cabin when she arrived. "He left you the conditions," she said gently. "What you did with them was yours." Jesse's cousin Arthur Finch wrote in December. The letter found Jesse through the Pine Ridge post office, forwarded from Harlan Voss's office in Helena, where Jesse had left a contact address. It was 3 pages in Arthur's practiced mercantile hand, organized, balanced, reading slightly like a ledger entry formatted as personal correspondence. Arthur had inherited, along with his 3 siblings, their grandparents' estate in Billings. The estate was extensive. Property, business interests, a house too large for any single family to maintain comfortably. Arthur wrote of it the way Jesse had heard men write about complicated horses, with respect for the animal's power and real wariness about its temperament. There were decisions to be made, relatives to be consulted, lawyers to be satisfied, and through all of it, the burden of maintaining something that had been built for a different era and didn't fit the present as well as anyone would have liked. "I don't say this to complain," Arthur wrote, with the precision of a man who had just spent 2 paragraphs complaining. "Only that I think of you sometimes and wonder if you are all right out there on your own. And then I think perhaps you have the simpler share of things." Jesse read this letter twice. He thought about the Barrett family's other inheritance, the large, complicated, attended one, versus the 60 acres of foothills that had been left to the one member of the family nobody had formally counted. Arthur was not wrong that his share was large. He was perhaps wrong that large meant better. Jesse wrote back that evening, brief and factual as always, reporting his location and his health. But he added a paragraph he had not originally planned. "The place is small but sound. I have good neighbors and I have Ambrose's notes, which are worth more than the land itself in some ways. I'm learning what I didn't know I needed to learn. I think the old man knew what he was doing better than any of us gave him credit for. Tell the family I'm well." He sealed the letter and set it on the stack for town. He sat a while longer at the table after, the stove ticking with warmth, Copperhead quiet in the barn. The December dark was absolute beyond the window. Inside, the lamp cast its circle. Tell the family I'm well. He was, he thought. He genuinely was. The letter that changed the winter arrived in the last week of December, also from Harlan Voss. It was brief. Attorney Voss wrote to inform Jesse that a competing claim had been filed against the Barrett parcel by a party asserting prior arrangement with Ambrose Barrett, specifically that an informal agreement existed between Ambrose and a neighboring land speculator named Caldwell Hurd, under which Hurd had been promised first right of purchase upon Ambrose's death. Voss was careful about his language. He did not say the claim had merit. He said it had been filed and that Jesse should be aware. He recommended Jesse respond promptly. Jesse set the letter on the table beside Ambrose's map and sat looking at it the way you sit looking at a problem that is large, but not, you tell yourself, impossible. He had expected some version of this. He had not expected it so soon. He was not afraid. He noted this with mild surprise, the absence of the specific cold stomach sensation he'd expected. What he felt instead was clear and angular. This was his land, fairly given and legally transferred, and someone wanted it, and the wanting of it was not the same as the having of it. He also felt, for the first time, the full weight of what the land meant to him, not as an inheritance, not as a curiosity, not as a gift from a stranger, as his. The stove he'd leveled, the wood he'd split, the map he'd annotated, the people who had come through the door and left something of themselves behind. He was not going to give it up. He picked up his pen and began drafting a response. Caldwell Hurd came to the parcel in the first week of January, which Jesse thought was either bold or stupid or both. He rode up on a roan horse accompanied by a second man who did not introduce himself and appeared to be present primarily as an audience for Hurd's performance. Hurd himself was 45 or so, broad-faced with the careful dress of a man who wanted to be taken for more prosperous than his surroundings quite confirmed. He had good boots and a mediocre coat, and the eyes of someone accustomed to calculating the distance between what he wanted and what he could get. Jesse was splitting wood in the yard. He set down the axe and waited. Hurd dismounted and introduced himself with the expansive ease of a man who had decided the meeting would go his way. He said he was sorry for the legal unpleasantness. The claim was simply a formality, he said, a matter of ensuring that an old gentleman's final wishes were honored in full. He had known Ambrose for years. They had discussed the land many times. He was sure, he said, that Jesse understood. Jesse understood several things. He understood that Hurd had arrived unannounced, that he had not corresponded through Attorney Voss as would be customary, and that the phrase "final wishes" was doing significant work in a sentence that contained no supporting documentation. "What did my grandfather put in writing?" Jesse said. Hurd smiled in the way of a man who had expected this question. Ambrose wasn't much for paperwork on personal matters. It was a conversation between neighbors, an understanding. He opened his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I'm not asking for anything that wasn't already agreed. I'm simply asking to be made whole on a prior arrangement." "A prior arrangement that wasn't in the will," Jesse said. "Wills don't always reflect the complete picture. Attorney Voss seems to think they do." The smile held but changed texture slightly, becoming more deliberate. "Lawyers think all kinds of things. Doesn't always reflect how things work between men on the ground." He looked around the yard with the evaluative attention of someone calculating square footage. "I'll offer fair value for the parcel. More than fair, given the elevation and the limitations of the meadow. You'd be set for a year or two, and you could find land better suited to a young man without the experience to develop this kind of terrain." Jesse let the silence hold for a moment. He thought about the map on the table inside. He thought about Ambrose's drainage notes and the conversation with Gil about the South Meadow soil, and the afternoon he and Harriet had cooked supper in the Dutch oven, while Gil told stories about the 1879 beans. He thought about the photograph leaning against the lamp. "The parcel isn't for sale," he said. "You might want to think carefully before—" "I've thought," Jesse said. He kept his voice level and his posture easy. He was not performing calmness. He felt calm in the specific way that comes from knowing clearly what you will and won't do. "If your claim has legal merit, I trust the legal process will show that. If it doesn't, I trust the same. Either way, this conversation isn't the place where it gets settled." He picked up the axe again. "I'll ask you not to come back to the property without going through Voss's office first." Hurd held the smile for another beat. Then he mounted the roan with the controlled movement of a man rearranging his intentions rather than abandoning them, tipped his hat, and rode out. The second man followed without having said a word. Jesse split 3 more rounds of wood before he went inside. He wrote to Voss that afternoon with a full account of the conversation, the time, the specific claims made, the offer, the response. He wrote it clearly and completely, including Hurd's phrases exactly as he'd used them. He had learned, working ranches, that the men who kept the best records were the ones who won disputes. He had always kept good records. He also wrote to Gil Foss, because Gil had lived in Pine Ridge for 20 years and knew who Caldwell Hurd was in a way that Voss's office in Helena couldn't know from the paperwork alone. He asked Gil, in plain terms, "Who is this man, and what has he done before?" Gil's response came back in 3 days, hand-delivered by a teenage boy from town who apparently served as Pine Ridge's informal postal relay. Hurd was a land speculator who had been working the territory for a decade, acquiring parcels through various means, some of them legitimate purchases, some of them of the kind that benefited from the relative isolation of landowners who didn't know their legal rights well. He had never been to Jesse's knowledge successfully disputed, Gil wrote, because most of the people he'd approached had either sold or given up. He had tried something similar with a widow named Pearson 5 years back. She had sold because she had no one to advise her and didn't know she could fight. The difference, Gil wrote in his plain, practical hand, is that you know you can fight, and you have people who'll stand behind you. Jesse read this letter twice. He said it with Voss's letter and his own account of the conversation. Then he made coffee and sat down with the land map and started building his case. The legal case, as Harlan Voss explained it in a long letter at the end of January, rested on a simple principle: an undocumented verbal agreement made between private parties, without witnesses, without consideration, and without any corroborating correspondence, did not constitute a legally enforceable claim against a properly executed will. Hurd's filing was aggressive, but thin. Voss's language was careful, as always, but Jesse read the confidence underneath it. The difficulty, Voss wrote, was time and cost. A formal legal challenge would require Jesse to appear in Helena for proceedings that might take several months to resolve. In the interim, the claim would create a cloud on the title, meaning Jesse could not sell the land, could not borrow against it, could not make certain improvements without the risk of the work being counted against him if the claim somehow prevailed. Voss did not think it would prevail. He also, carefully, could not guarantee that. Jesse read this letter in the evening with the stove going and the January cold pressing at the window. He had $73, including the $23 from Ambrose's package and what remained of his final season's wages from Halverson. He had 6 cattle and a kitchen garden's worth of supplies. He had a parcel of land and a cabin full of journals and a neighbor who had stood behind him already. He also had, he was finding, a stubbornness that surprised him with its depth. He had never thought of himself as particularly stubborn. He was adaptable. He had to be, working seasonal labor. And he was patient. But there was a difference, he was discovering, between patience and flexibility. He could be flexible about nearly everything. He was not, it turned out, flexible about this. He went to see Gil the next morning. They sat at Gil's kitchen table, which was larger than Jesse's and bore the marks of 20 years of community use. Coffee rings, a knife scar on the edge, initials that did not belong to anyone currently in the household. Harriet set out coffee and then, reading the room, quietly left them to it. Jesse laid out the situation completely. The claim, the legal letter, the timeline, the costs. Gil listened without interrupting, which was a quality Jesse had come to rely on. When Jesse finished, Gil was quiet for a moment. "Hurd has done this before," Jesse said. "I told you that." "I want to know more specifically. Other parcels, other people he approached, anything documented." Gil turned his coffee cup. "There's Roy Halstead over on the East Ridge. Hurd made a similar approach to him about 7 years back. Roy's a stubborn man and told him to go back where he came from, but he never filed anything because it didn't get to a legal stage," he thought. "There's the Pearson widow I mentioned. Would she talk to Voss?" Gil looked at him with a new quality of attention. "You want to build a pattern. Voss said the claim is thin. I want to make it thinner." "Halstead will talk," Gil said. "He doesn't like Hurd and he's not shy about it. Mrs. Pearson moved to Bozeman after she sold, but I have her daughter's address." He paused. "I should also tell you, there are people in town who have opinions about Hurd. Some of them have been waiting for someone to push back." "What kind of people?" "Walt Briggs, for one. Hurd approached him about a grazing rights arrangement 3 years back that Walt considered less than honest. Walt declined, but it left a taste." Gil met Jesse's eyes. "The thing about a man like Hurd is that he works on the isolated ones. He chooses people who don't have a community around them to consult. He counts on people not comparing notes." Jesse thought about this. He thought about Ambrose, living alone on the parcel for 20 years, not associating. He thought about Hurd at the yard, looking around with that evaluating eye, talking about a young man without the experience to develop this kind of terrain. Hurd had looked at him and seen the same person he always looked for, isolated, uncertain, without resources. It was a reasonable assessment based on available information. The available information was incomplete. "I want to hold a meeting," Jesse said. "At your place, if Harriet is willing. Anyone in the community who has had dealings with Hurd or who knows someone who has. I want to document it properly and send it to Voss, and I want Hurd to know that we've done it." Gil was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather was a private man. He was a good man. I want to say that clearly. But he was private to a fault. He lived on that land for 20 years and he managed his life alone and he was careful about what he asked of people." He looked at Jesse directly. "You are not doing that." "No," Jesse said. "That's the right call." Gil stood up. He went to the door between the kitchen and the sitting room and opened it. "Harriet," he called, "we're going to need the table Saturday." Harriet's voice came back dry and unsurprised from the other room. "I'll make more bread." Jesse looked at the large scarred table with its coffee rings and knife marks and borrowed initials. He thought that 20 years from now, if his own table looked like that, he would have done something right. The Saturday meeting at the Foss house drew 11 people, which was more than Jesse had expected and, from Gil's expression, approximately what Gil had expected. Walt Briggs came with his foreman, a quiet man named Orville Steen, who had direct knowledge of Hurd's grazing rights approach, and was willing to put it in writing. Roy Halstead came from the East Ridge, accompanied by his son, and sat down with the contained energy of a man who had been waiting for an opportunity to be useful about something specific. Margaret Crane came without her husband, who had a winter cold, and brought the practical administrative instincts of a woman who had been keeping accurate records of community business for 15 years. Ruth Adler came and sat at the end of the table and said nothing for the first 40 minutes, observing the room with the expression of someone grading a performance. Jesse had prepared. He laid out the situation in plain terms, the legal claim, what it meant, what documenting a pattern of similar approaches might accomplish. He was careful not to editorialize or embellish. The facts, laid flat on the table, were sufficient. Walt spoke first. His account of the grazing rights proposal was specific, dated, and unflattering to Hurd in ways that were based entirely on observed facts. Orville Steen added 2 additional details. Roy Halstead followed with his account, which was shorter but corroborating on the central point. Hurd had approached him with a claim of prior arrangement that also lacked documentation. Margaret said, with the precise calm of a woman who managed inventory for a living, "If I've learned one thing from dry goods, it's that a supplier who can't show you the paper on an arrangement doesn't have an arrangement. He has an expectation." This produced a quality of shared recognition around the table that was almost audible. Jesse took notes throughout, writing in the ledger he'd bought at Crane's store, the same one he'd been using for the parcel plans. He wrote each account clearly and asked clarifying questions when dates or details were vague. He did not hurry anyone. By the end of the afternoon, he had 7 documented accounts of varying degrees of direct relevance to the claim, each one witnessed by the others in the room. He also had a letter of community character, drafted collectively and signed by all 11 people present, stating that Jesse Allen Barrett had established himself as a responsible and committed landowner and neighbor in the Pine Ridge community since October of 1888. Ruth Adler spoke for the first time as people were putting on their coats. "Your grandfather," she said to Jesse, "would have found this meeting extremely uncomfortable." "Yes," Jesse said. "He would have been glad you did it anyway." Jesse sent the package to Voss the following Monday. The documented accounts, the community letter, and a covering note that summarized the material and asked Voss to use it as he saw fit in responding to the claim. Voss wrote back in 10 days. His letter was the most openly positive communication Jesse had received from him. The material was, Voss wrote, exactly the kind of corroborating evidence that would make a frivolous claim untenable. He would be filing a formal response to the challenge within the week, and he anticipated the matter being dismissed without requiring Jesse's appearance in Helena. Jesse read this letter at the kitchen table, and then folded it carefully and added it to the growing stack in the oilskin he kept for documents. February came in gray and steady, the snow falling with the unhurried accumulation of a season that has all the time in the world. Jesse managed the stock, kept the wood split, checked the cistern daily, and continued, in the evenings, his work on the land plan. The parcel map was now covered in a second layer of annotation, his own, in the new ledger's ink, overlaid on Ambrose's 30 years of observation. The 2 handwritings were different in style, but converged, he noticed, on similar conclusions. They had walked the same ground from different years and read it the same way. He found this quietly remarkable. He had begun, over the winter, to understand what the journals were. They were not an explanation. They were not an apology, though Ruth Adler's reading of them had that right. They were a record of someone building something and wanting that record to be useful to whoever came next. Ambrose had built the cabin and managed the land and kept the notes for 20 years. And somewhere in those 20 years, he had made the decision that Jesse was the one the record was for. He had not been able to say so directly. He had done it the only way available to him. He had made the record complete, and he had left the door on good hinges, and he had trusted that the person who opened it would understand. Jesse thought, working through February's quiet evenings, that this was a form of faith, not the formal kind, the practical kind, the faith of a farmer in good soil, the faith of a builder in a well-set foundation. You do the work correctly, and you trust that correctness has consequences. He was trying to be worthy of it. He thought, more often as the weeks passed, that he might be getting there. The legal challenge was formally dismissed in the third week of February. Voss's letter arrived on a Thursday morning, concise and final. The opposing party had withdrawn the claim after receiving the formal response and supporting documentation. No further proceedings would be required. The title was clear. Jesse read the letter twice. He set it down. He went outside and stood in the yard in the February morning, the snow crunching under his boots, the sky the pale pewter color it held most of the month, and stood there for a while doing nothing in particular. Copperhead watched him from the barn doorway with the patient skepticism of a horse who had observed humans behaving oddly for years and had formed no charitable conclusions. Jesse went back inside and made coffee. He wrote to Voss with his thanks and the settlement of the legal fees, which had been less than he'd feared, partly because the case had been brief and partly because he suspected Voss had been conservative with his billing. He wrote to Gil and Harriet with the news. He wrote brief notes to Walt Briggs and Roy Halstead and Margaret Crane and Ruth Adler, thanking each of them for their help. He wrote last to Arthur Finch in Billings. "The parcel is clear," he wrote. "Someone made a run at it and it didn't hold. I had good help." He paused over the next lines longer than he usually paused over letters. "I've been reading the old man's journals all winter. 20 years of notes on this land, written like he expected someone to use them. He was right to expect it. I use them every day. I think he was a man who loved people at a distance because he didn't trust his own capacity for closeness. I recognize something in that. I think the land was his way of saying what he couldn't say in person." Another pause. "I intend to not do that. I intend to say things directly while I still can. I'm well. The land is mine, and the winter is nearly done, and I have neighbors who will stand behind you if you let them know you need it. I hope things are sorting out in Billings. Write when you can." He sealed the letter and set it on the town stack. He looked around the cabin, the stove ticking, the map on the table, the photograph leaning against the lamp. The land was his. He had defended it. And now spring was coming. The last journal ended on a February page, 1888, 6 months before Ambrose died. Jesse had been saving it. He had known for weeks he was approaching the end of the 9th journal, had slowed his reading accordingly, taken the evenings more carefully. He read the final entries by the window light, the late February sun beginning to carry actual warmth for the first time in months. The last entry was not dramatic. It did not make announcements or deliver final instructions. It was characteristically a record, weather conditions, a note about the cistern's spring level, a brief observation about the timber on the north slope, and then, at the bottom of the page, this: "I have left Jesse everything I know how to leave. I don't know if it's enough. I've asked myself that question for most of the years represented in these books, and I haven't found a comfortable answer. A man can do the work correctly and still not know if the right person will find it useful. I think he will. I think I've always known that. But knowing it and having said it are different things, and I've spent my life on the wrong side of that distance, and I can't fix it now. The stove leans slightly west. I meant to fix that in spring." Jesse sat with the closed journal in his hands for a long time. The stove did not lean west. He had fixed it in October, his first week on the parcel, reading the note in the maintenance journal and doing the work. He had fixed it without knowing it was the last thing Ambrose had left undone. He pressed his hand flat against the journal's cover. The fire in the stove was steady and straight. He did not sleep well that night. Not from grief exactly, though what he felt had something of grief's texture. That late-arriving weight of something ending that you didn't know had been ongoing. He lay in the bunk under the gray wool blanket with the red stripe and looked at the ceiling and tried to put words to what he was feeling with the same methodical attention he gave to everything, and found, for once, that the methodology was insufficient. Here was what he knew. He had spent 18 years belonging to no one and nowhere in particular. He had grown up in a house where he was carefully and kindly accommodated, which was not the same as being essential. And he had internalized this distinction so early and so completely that he had never once questioned whether things could be different. You work. You follow the season. You leave when the need is finished. This was not unhappiness. It was just the shape of things. Here was what else he knew. In the 4 months since he'd found this cabin, something had shifted. He had fixed the stove and stacked the wood and walked the boundaries and attended a community gathering and sat at Gil's table and watched 11 people ride through the cold to help him hold what was his. He had learned the creek and the cistern and the meadow and the particular silence of the parcel on a clear night, which was different from the silence of any other place he'd been, in a way he could feel but not explain. He had become, without quite planning it, necessary somewhere. And the man who had built all of this, who had set the stove and built the bunk and written the notes and driven the boundary cairns and filled the shelves with 3 months of supplies and trusted finally that Jesse would come. That man was gone. He had been gone since August. Jesse had known this. He had thought about it in the abstract. Lying in the bunk in late February with the 9th journal closed on the table, he felt the goneness of it in a way that was specific and sharp. He would have liked to sit across that table from Ambrose Barrett and drink coffee out of the blue tin cups and ask him, directly, why didn't you come? Why didn't you write? Was it worth it? All those years of watching from a distance, was it worth it compared to what a single conversation might have given you? He did not think he would have gotten a comfortable answer. He thought perhaps the answer would have been no, that Ambrose at the end would have looked at his 9 journals of careful observation and his 20 years of solitary labor and said, I got the land right and the distance wrong. But he also thought Ambrose had known this. The entries were a man building something against time, knowing the time was wrong, doing it anyway because doing it was the only honest option left. Jesse lay in the dark for a long time. Then slowly, something settled. Not a resolution exactly, more like a choice becoming clear. He would not live on the wrong side of that distance. He would not accumulate the knowledge of people he loved and hold it in journals and hope someone would read it after he was gone. He would say it directly, while there was still time to say it. He rose at dawn, as he always did. He made coffee. He stood at the window and watched the eastern ridge go from charcoal to rose to gold in the way it did every clear morning, which was frequently this high and this far from the valley's weather. He had lived in this cabin for 4 months. In those 4 months he had learned the land and fixed what needed fixing and defended the title and made friends and read every word his grandfather had written and become, slowly, honestly, without planning it, someone who had a place in the world. He had one thing left to do. He got out the writing paper and the ink and the good pen he'd bought at Crane's in November. He thought for a moment about where to start. Then he began writing a letter to Arthur Finch, not the brief factual letters he'd been sending for years, but a real one, long, honest, the kind that said what it meant. I've been thinking about family, he wrote, and about distance, and about the difference between the two. I think we've let the distance be larger than the family because neither of us knew how to say that was wrong. I'm saying it now. He wrote for 2 hours, without stopping. When he was done, he set the letter aside and picked up a second piece of paper. He had more to say and more people to say it to. Spring came to the parcel at an elevation-appropriate pace, carefully, incrementally, with frequent reminders that it was not yet committed to the arrangement. March brought snowmelt and mud and the sudden noise of the creek running high and fast with runoff, and Jesse spent 2 weeks managing the drainage along the south meadow bank the way Ambrose's notes described, cutting the shallow ditch deeper where it had silted over the winter and shoring up the bank at the one weak point where the soil ran close to the surface. The work was cold and wet and satisfying in the dense way of work that prevents future problems rather than solving present ones. He had sent the letters. Arthur wrote back in the second week of March, sooner than Jesse had expected. The letter was 3 times the length of any letter Arthur had ever written him. It was not polished. Arthur was a businessman, not a writer, and some of it read like he'd stopped and started several times. But it was honest, and it said things that had apparently been waiting to be said for a while. He was sorry for the years of careful, managed distance. He had not known what Jesse needed because he had never asked. He was asking now. Jesse wrote back that same evening. He said what he meant. It was not difficult. He had practice now. He also wrote to Harlan Voss with a simple question. Was there anything in Ambrose's estate documentation that indicated why the old man had never made contact? He suspected the answer was complicated, but he wanted whatever record there was. Voss's response was characteristically measured. The estate papers were silent on the question, but attached to them was a letter addressed to no one that Ambrose had apparently written and then chosen not to include with the formal documentation. Voss enclosed a copy. Jesse read it at the table with the coffee going cold beside him. It was a draft, corrected in several places, crossed out and rewritten. Ambrose had clearly written it more than once. In its final form it said, essentially, that he had stayed away because he believed his presence would be a complication rather than a benefit. He had left the family badly decades earlier. Jesse gathered the references were to some rupture with his son James, Jesse's father, and he had carried the weight of that badly for the rest of his life. He had not trusted himself to come back into Jesse's life without doing more damage than good. I am aware this may be cowardice dressed as consideration, the draft read, in a line that had been crossed out twice and then rewritten as if the crossing out was not the final word. I am aware that the one person who could tell me which it was is the one person I cannot ask. Jesse set the letter down. He looked at the photograph of Ambrose on the shelf. It was both, he said conversationally to the photograph. You were right about that. He picked up his pen. He did not write to no one. He wrote to the specific people who mattered. Gil and Harriet Foss, Walt Briggs, Roy Halstead, Margaret Crane, Ruth Adler. Short letters, each of them simple and direct. He thanked them, specifically, for the winter, for the ham and the Dutch oven lesson and the meetings and the letters and the 11 people on a cold Saturday in January who had ridden through the snow to stand behind him. He told them what it had meant. He did not dress it up or qualify it. He said it flat and honest and signed his name. He also, after some deliberation, included with Gil and Harriet's letter an invitation. He would be putting in the kitchen garden in April and expanding the hay patch as planned. He was going to do it right and do it completely. And when it was done, when the parcel was properly producing for the first time under his management, he would like to have people to supper, not a formal occasion. Just supper at the table in the good company of the people who had helped him get there. He wrote, Harriet, I've been practicing with the Dutch oven. I make no claims about the beans, but the biscuits are coming along. He sent the letters to town with a rider on the Thursday supply run. On Friday morning, he walked the south meadow in the thin spring sunshine and turned the first sod of the kitchen garden with Ambrose's long-handled spade, which had been hanging on the barn wall all winter, waiting for exactly this. The soil was dark and deep on the south end, near the creek bank. Exactly as Ambrose had noted, exactly as Jesse had read 20 years of cultivation into this ground and believed it would be. He turned 3 rows before his shoulders told him to stop, and he stopped and leaned on the spade and looked at the open, dark earth and the creek running fast behind it, and the ridge above, green now with the first push of new growth coming up through the old snow-matted grass. This, he thought, was what the old man had meant to give him. Not the land itself, not the acres and the timber and the water rights, the conditions, the prepared ground, the record of everything he needed to know to start. He bent and picked up a handful of soil. Good, dark, ready. He started the 4th row. April moved through the parcel like it owned the place, which Jesse was willing to agree it did. The kitchen garden went in over 2 weeks. The same crops Ambrose had grown, extended north into the area Jesse had spent the winter preparing with the compost work, the thin shale ground that now had a layer of turned organic material that would, Ambrose's notes predicted and Jesse's own observation confirmed, improve markedly each season if managed consistently. He planted beans and squash and late-season kale and a row of root vegetables along the creekside edge where the soil was deepest. He followed Ambrose's planting calendar, annotated over decades, which indicated not just what to plant when, but which specific combinations had worked in combination in this specific ground at this specific elevation. 20 years of data. Jesse used all of it. He also expanded the hay patch as planned, clearing the east end of the meadow and turning the sod under to let it rest before the first cutting. The work was large. He needed help for the clearing, and Gil brought his oldest son, a 16-year-old named Will, for 2 days of fence post work along the new east edge. Will was quiet in the manner of teenagers who have decided that observation is smarter than declaration, and he worked hard and well and accepted instruction without resistance, which Jesse recognized as a quality worth noting. At the end of the second day, Jesse paid Will in cash at the standard day labor rate without waiting to be asked. Will looked at the money with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of an arrangement. "Thank you, sir," he said. "You did the work," Jesse said. "That's how it goes." He thought for a moment. "Come back when the hay's ready to cut. I'll need help." Will nodded, satisfied, and went home with his father. Jesse stood in the evening yard and looked at the expanded meadow, the new fence posts running straight along the east edge. The garden rose beyond, the cabin with its good cedar walls and its fixed stove and its window facing east. He had visitors that weekend. Margaret Crane came on Saturday with her husband Francis, who turned out to be a quiet, observant man, with a great deal of accumulated knowledge about small-scale cattle management, which Jesse had not known. They walked the pasture together for an hour while Margaret and Harriet, who had come with Gil, talked in the cabin with a productive industriousness that Jesse gathered had something to do with community governance and something to do with the availability of decent fabric in the Pine Ridge store and something to do with both simultaneously. Ruth Adler came on Sunday afternoon alone, which Jesse had learned was Ruth's preferred mode of transport in every sense. She walked the garden rows without commentary, checked the soil with her fingers at several points, examined the drainage work along the creek bank, and came back to where Jesse was waiting by the fence. "Good work," she said. From Ruth Adler, Jesse had learned this was the equivalent of a formal citation. They sat on the cabin porch. Ambrose had built a bench along the front wall that caught the afternoon sun, and drank coffee and talked about the coming season. Ruth had been in Pine Ridge since 1858 and had watched the territory change in ways that gave her a long view of most things. She talked about the land cycles she'd seen, the wet years and the dry, the ways in which the mountain parcels tended to outlast the valley claims because the elevation kept them out of the path of speculation. "Herd won't try again," she said at one point without preamble. "No," Jesse agreed. "He picks the isolated ones," she said. "He looked at your parcel and saw a young man alone with no roots and no community. He was wrong." She looked at him with the accurate, unsentimental attention that was her particular form of warmth. "Your grandfather built this place so you'd have the ground under you. You built the rest yourself." Jesse thought about this. "He chose well," Jesse said, "sending me here. The land was right for me." "He knew you," Ruth said simply. "Watched you for 14 years. A man who watches that carefully knows what a person needs." The sun was long and warm on the porch bench. The creek ran its steady conversation below the meadow. Copperhead was visible in the pasture, engaged in what appeared to be a philosophical disagreement with one of the fence posts. Jesse thought about Ambrose on this bench in these same afternoons, watching the ridge go gold. He thought about the 9 journals and the oilskin packages and the stove that had leaned and was now straight. He thought about a man who had loved quietly and at a distance for so long that the distance had become a habit, and the cabin was the last corrective, the one act of closing the distance that he could still manage. "He did know me," Jesse said. "It came out softly, not planned. Better than I knew him. That's a strange thing." "Not strange," Ruth said. "Just unfinished. You'll finish it." She finished her coffee and stood up with the efficiency of a woman who had given you what she'd come to give and had other things to do. She shook his hand, mounted her horse, and rode back toward Pine Ridge without looking back. Jesse sat a while longer on the bench his grandfather had built, in the sun his grandfather had sat in, watching the same ridge go gold. The supper happened on the second Saturday of May. Jesse had planned it carefully, not formally, but practically, in the way he planned everything. He knew how many people were coming. 11, which was the same number who had come to the January meeting at Gil's house. And this felt right to him in a way he didn't try to analyze. He had food for 14, because Ambrose's hospitality notes from the journals recommended planning for more than expected, and Jesse had found this advice, like most of the advice in the journals, correct. He cooked all day, Friday and Saturday morning. The Dutch oven produced a creditable pot of beans, notably unlike the 1879 incident in all respects, along with biscuits which had indeed come along, and a roast he had been slow cooking since dawn. He had bought 2 pies from Margaret Crane's kitchen because he was realistic about his limitations, and pies remained beyond his current capabilities. People arrived through the afternoon, horses tied at the fence, voices carrying across the yard. The cabin filled. Jesse had brought 2 of Ambrose's chairs from storage in the barn, and with the bench along the porch wall there was room for everyone, if not in a fashion that would have satisfied a furniture arrangement. Nobody seemed to mind. People brought things: bread and a pot of early-season preserves from Harriet Foss, dried apple cake from a woman named Dell Briggs, who was Walt's wife and who Jesse was meeting for the first time. Will Foss came with his parents and stood near the door at first in the familiar posture of someone who has spent years being new somewhere. And Jesse recognized this and made the same move Gil had made for him in November. Just the natural move of introducing someone to the room. No ceremony. No announcement. Ruth Adler arrived last and alone, and sat at the end of the table and looked around the room with an expression that was, Jesse thought, as close to contented as Ruth's face allowed. After supper, in the long May evening light that held until nearly 9, people drifted onto the porch and into the yard. Conversation moved the way it moves at good gatherings, freely, without agenda, circling between the practical and the personal, the seasonal and the philosophical. Gil found Jesse standing near the fence post at the edge of the meadow, looking at the garden rose catching the last light. "Good night," Gil said. "Yes," Jesse agreed. "Your grandfather would have liked this." He said it without sentiment, just as a fact. He would have hated it, Jesse said. He would have been miserable and uncomfortable the whole time. He paused. And then he would have been glad it happened. Gil laughed. It was the first time Jesse had heard him laugh fully, and it was a good sound. They stood together watching the meadow go to shadow, while the voices from the porch continued their easy movement behind them. Jesse thought about the opening entry in the first journal. "I rode north today and did not look back." He thought about the closing entry of the 9th. "I can't fix it now." He looked at the garden he had planted, the fence he had mended, the meadow he had expanded, the cabin with its window facing east. He had fixed it. On the Sunday morning after the supper, Jesse rose at first light, as he always did. He made coffee in the blue tin. He took it outside and sat on the porch bench his grandfather had built in the early sun, facing the eastern ridge. The parcel was quiet in the specific way of a morning after people have been in it. Not empty, but resting. The yard still held the impression of the gathering, a forgotten hat on the fence post, the particular settled quality of ground that has been walked on by many feet. The coffee tin cups from the porch were stacked by the door. Jesse would wash them later. He had the 9th journal on the bench beside him. He had read it through once more after everyone left, sitting at the table in the late lamplight, all 9 books laid out in order. He opened it to the last page. Ambrose's final entry. "I have left Jesse everything I know how to leave." Jesse took out his pen. Beneath Ambrose's entry, careful and unhurried, he wrote, "May 1889. You left enough. More than enough. The stove is straight, the garden is in, and the south meadow is better than you found it. I had 11 people to supper last night in this cabin, and I want you to know it happened. I will keep this record going the way you kept it. Whoever comes after me will have what I had, 20 years of your notes and however many of mine. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the door on good hinges." He set the pen down. He picked up his coffee. The ridge went gold. The creek ran clean and cold below the meadow, as it always had, as it would for a very long time to come. Thank you so much for sticking with the story all the way to the end. It genuinely means a lot. I hope it kept you company for a little while and maybe took your mind somewhere new. If you enjoyed it, go ahead and give the video a hype and drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I always love reading those. It still gets me every time how far these stories end up traveling. If this is your first time here, hey, welcome. There's a whole bunch more stories on the channel, so feel free to hang around and explore. And if you've been here before, seriously, thank you for coming back. It means more than you know. If you know someone who'd enjoy a good story, Sharing it with them is one of the best ways to help the channel grow. All right, I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.